In the heart of the Ottoman Empire stood a prison gilded in gold, a place where princes were born only to be buried alive in silence. Behind jeweled screens and perfumed corridors, brothers strangled brothers, and heirs slowly lost their minds in the name of power. This is not myth nor imagination. It is the true story of Sultan Ibrahim I, the Padishah who lived and died within the same cage that shaped his madness. Long before the crown touched his brow, Prince Ibrahim was a prisoner of royal blood. The corridors of Topkapı Palace were his entire world, a maze of marble and shadow where laughter was forbidden, and silence ruled more fiercely than any sultan. He was born in 1615, the youngest of many sons to Sultan Ahmed I, and by the time he could walk, he was already marked by the empire's cruelest tradition, the kafes, or the cage. The kafes was not a cage of iron, but of velvet and gold. It was a secluded section of the palace, guarded by eunuchs and surrounded by latticework that hid the sunlight. Within its walls lived the forgotten princes of the Ottoman dynasty, potential heirs locked away to prevent civil war. Some lived there for years, others for decades, aging quietly like birds in captivity. For young Ibrahim, it was the only home he knew. From the moment he could understand speech, he heard whispers of his brothers strangled with silk cords, of concubines drowned in the Bosporus, of children declared illegitimate and erased from history. Every night, he dreamed of the muffled sobs of another royal boy being led down the hall, never to return. The empire's peace was built on these silent murders, and the kafes was its beating heart. Inside the cage, time did not pass as it did outside. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into years. The princes were denied books that spoke of freedom, denied windows that opened wide enough to see the world beyond the courtyards. The only sounds were the footsteps of guards and the call to prayer echoing from distant minarets, haunting reminders of a city that belonged to them only in name. Ibrahim's mind began to warp under the stillness. He was watched constantly, not for his safety, but to ensure he did not try to escape. He developed the habit of whispering to the walls, believing they could remember what he could not speak aloud. "Do they still kill us?" he once asked his nurse. Her eyes lowered, and she made no answer. That silence spoke louder than truth ever could. When his elder brother Murad IV ascended to the throne, the executions began anew. Ibrahim heard the silk cords tighten behind the walls. He knew which nights meant blood. Each time a brother's life ended, he expected the same hands to come for him. But they never did. He was spared, though he did not understand why. To be spared was not mercy. It was a longer sentence. Years passed. Murad ruled with iron cruelty, and Ibrahim remained his shadow, alive but not living. He paced the same corridors his murdered brothers once walked, his thoughts feeding on fear. The kafes bred madness as easily as it bred princes. He began to imagine voices in the dark, whispers calling him by name. Sometimes he would wake in panic, convinced that the silk cord had already found his throat. When word finally came that Murad IV was dead, the eunuchs entered the kafes. Ibrahim shrank from them, believing it was his turn to die. But instead they bowed. "Your Majesty," one said softly, "the throne awaits." The boy who had lived half a lifetime in silence was now sultan. Yet as he stepped out into the sunlight for the first time, he did not see freedom. He saw the same walls, only larger, the same prison disguised as a throne. The morning Ibrahim ascended the throne, the empire exhaled, though none dared to say whether it was from relief or dread. After years of bloodshed under Murad IV, the court hoped for a gentler ruler. Yet those who looked upon the new sultan saw not a sovereign, but a man who still carried the tremors of confinement in his bones. His first days in power were marked not by decrees, but by silence. He moved like one awakening from a nightmare, uncertain if he had truly escaped. The world outside the caves was blinding. The courtyards were wide, the air thick with jasmine and the scent of freshly polished marble. Yet Ibrahim found no comfort in beauty. Every servant's glance seemed suspicious, every whisper a conspiracy. He could not bear the sight of open doors, fearing that one led back to the cage. He slept little, his dreams replaying the moments of strangulation he had overheard as a child. Silk cords, tightening around the throats of princes he had never dared to love. In the first weeks, the palace tried to celebrate him. Musicians played in the gardens, poets recited verses comparing him to Solomon and Alexander. But Ibrahim could not hear praise without hearing mockery. When a courtier spoke too softly, he demanded to know what was being hidden. When a soldier saluted too slowly, he ordered punishment. His paranoia became his advisor, his fear his counselor. It was said that during audiences, his eyes never stayed still. He studied faces as though they were masks concealing blades. Ministers learned to speak only when asked and to kneel longer than required. Even Qasim Sultan, his mother, tread carefully in his presence. The boy she had once protected now ruled an empire she no longer controlled. Her attempts to guide him were met with quiet resentment, the same resentment that festers in men who have tasted humiliation too long. The palace eunuchs whispered that Ibrahim sometimes wandered at night through the harem, muttering to himself, running his hands along the walls as if searching for the seams of an invisible cell. Once, a servant claimed to have seen him crouched in a corner, whispering to his reflection in a copper bowl of water. "They said I was mad," he murmured. "But madness was my inheritance." The servant was never seen again. Despite his instability, the empire obeyed. None dared defy the Padishah, not yet. The fear of returning to chaos kept the court silent. But beyond the palace, the world shifted. The wars in Persia had drained the treasury, trade faltered, and famine began to creep across Anatolia. In taverns and mosques, men whispered that the new sultan was cursed, that the cage had birthed not a ruler, but a ghost wearing a crown. Ibrahim, though surrounded by servants and luxury, remained a prisoner of his own making. The throne felt heavier than the walls that once confined him. He ordered the windows of his chamber sealed, claiming that the wind carries poison. He trusted no messenger, no vizier, not even the food brought to him. What began as cautious rule slowly bent toward tyranny. When Qasim Sultan entered his chamber one night to soothe him, she found him clutching the royal seal, trembling. "They will bury me alive, mother," he whispered, "just as they buried my brothers." Her hand rested upon his shoulder, but even her touch could not pierce the shadow that had followed him from the cage. The empire had freed its prisoner, only to make him king of his own fears. Qasim Sultan had ruled longer than most men lived. She had survived 4 sons and buried 3. Her power was quiet, patient, and woven into every corner of the Topkapı Palace in the voices of the eunuchs, the whispers of the harem, and the signatures of viziers who feared her more than they feared death. When Ibrahim became sultan, she thought she had secured the empire's stability once more. But she had underestimated what a lifetime of confinement had done to her son's mind. At first, Ibrahim depended on her entirely. He would not sign a decree unless she approved it. Ministers could not approach him without her presence. To the outside world, the empire appeared balanced, a mother guiding her fragile son through the storms of rule. But beneath that illusion simmered a growing resentment. Ibrahim began to feel the same suffocation he had known in the caves. Every time his mother corrected his speech, denied his impulses, or counseled caution, it echoed the same control that had once caged him. He wanted to be a ruler, not a ward. Yet every decision he made seemed to dissolve under her gaze. When he spoke of building monuments to his reign, she called it wasteful. When he sought new concubines, she reminded him of duty and restraint. Her words, meant as guidance, landed like chains on his pride. And pride, in a sultan, was far more dangerous than madness. In the harem, the rivalry between mother and son took form in servants and shadows. Kaiksem placed her loyal women around Ibrahim, hoping to watch over him. He, in turn, replaced them with concubines of his own choosing, women who flattered his ego and whispered against his mother. One of them, a Circassian beauty known as Zivakar, became his favorite. She called Qasim the old serpent when the sultan was drunk enough to laugh. But behind her smile, even she feared the old woman's reach. The palace air grew heavy with suspicion. Spies eavesdropped on prayers. Eunuchs changed allegiances overnight. What began as a domestic power struggle turned into an invisible war. Kaiksem tried to reason with her son, warning him that paranoia would destroy him. Ibrahim accused her of plotting to dethrone him in favor of another heir. "You ruled through my father," he told her one night, his voice low. "But you will not rule through me." Her face hardened, though her heart broke. She had caged him to protect him. Now he would cage her to prove his freedom. Soon after, Ibrahim began restricting her influence. Her seal was removed from official decrees. Ministers who spoke in her defense were dismissed or vanished quietly. For the first time in decades, the empire trembled without her control. Qasim's chambers became quieter. She prayed at dawn, her voice echoing against the tiles that had once carried laughter. She knew her son was slipping beyond her reach, consumed by the shadows she had once kept at bay. One evening, she watched from her lattice window as Ibrahim paraded through the courtyard, his robes heavy with gold, his expression hollow. He waved to no one. The drums beat not for joy, but to mask the unease spreading through the court. In the reflection of her mirror, Kaiksem saw the truth she could not deny. The cage had never truly opened. It had only changed its keeper. By the time the first cries of his newborn son echoed through the harem, Sultan Ibrahim was no longer a man but an echo of his fears. The birth should have brought celebration, incense burning through the corridors, silk gifts sent to the midwives, and prayers of gratitude offered at dawn. Yet instead of joy, the Sultan felt only dread. He did not see a child. He saw a rival. The Ottoman throne was no stranger to blood spilled in the name of succession. For centuries, brothers had slain brothers to preserve the empire. It was law wrapped in tradition, cruelty disguised as order. But Ibrahim had spent too many years listening to the stories of those silken deaths. He had watched the empire's sons vanish one by one, their names erased from the records, their mothers buried in silence. Now, with heirs of his own, he feared history would return, this time for him. He ordered that no one be told how many sons had been born. The harem's attendants whispered of 7, others said 9. None dared count. The Sultan's paranoia grew with each infant's cry. He would pace the corridors at night, muttering that one of them would end his life, just as he had once feared his brother's command. The harem, once a place of music and perfume, turned into a prison of whispers. Concubines were forbidden to leave their chambers. The midwives who had delivered the royal infants were dismissed. Some disappeared entirely. Ibrahim appointed guards to patrol the women's quarters, ensuring no letters left the palace. Even the cries of the newborn seemed to offend him. "They mock me," he told a servant. "Even in their cradles they conspire." Kaiksem Sultan tried to calm him. She reminded him that these were his sons, his blood, the empire's future. But he could no longer distinguish between love and betrayal. In his mind, blood was not a bond. It was a curse that chained men to their doom. One evening, the wet nurse of his youngest son was summoned to his chamber. She trembled as she entered, carrying the swaddled child in her arms. The Sultan approached slowly, his eyes glimmering with both wonder and terror. "Does he dream?" he asked her. She nodded, uncertain. Ibrahim smiled faintly. "Then he dreams of my death." He turned away, leaving the nurse shaking, the child wailing in confusion. Days later, the Sultan ordered a new wing of the harem to be sealed off. He called it the Quiet House. Inside, the youngest concubines and their infants were confined, never to be seen again. Servants who carried food to its doors spoke of eerie silence, no crying, no laughter, only the faint scent of milk and incense. It was said the Sultan visited at night, walking barefoot, listening to the silence he had created. His madness fed upon isolation. The empire's affairs languished. Petitions went unanswered. While famine gnawed at the provinces, the Sultan obsessed over omens. He studied the stars, believing they warned of betrayal. When a comet appeared over Constantinople, he declared it a sign that the wounds of the harem must be cleansed. What he meant, none dared ask. By dawn, several women and infants had vanished from the palace records. The corridors of Topkapı were quiet once again, the kind of quiet that follows only after fear has done its work. In the suffocating peace that followed, Ibrahim stood by a window, staring toward the Bosporus. "They think me mad," he whispered to the sea. "But madness is only truth that others cannot bear." The waves did not answer. Only the wind moved, carrying away the last lullabies of the children who would never grow to call him father. By the mid-1640s, Sultan Ibrahim's fear had ripened into extravagance. The empire bled, yet the palace gleamed brighter than ever before. To those outside the walls of Topkapı, famine and plague consumed the land. To those within, the Sultan's madness took a new form, indulgence disguised as divine right. The man who once trembled in the shadows of confinement now demanded the world kneel before his imagined grandeur. He began with the walls. Ibrahim ordered every chamber he entered to be lined with fur, sable, ermine, and lynx imported from distant lands. The air grew heavy with the scent of oil and amber. The ceilings shimmered under candlelight like molten gold. Courtiers whispered that the Sultan's feet never touched bare stone again. Instead, he walked only upon the skins of animals slaughtered in his name. When a servant accidentally scuffed the fur beneath his throne, he was executed for disturbing royal divinity. It was in this fever of opulence that Ibrahim declared himself the lion of the age. He believed his splendor reflected divine favor, that his pleasure was proof of God's will. He ordered massive shipments of musk and myrrh, claiming that the scent of the harem must rival the gardens of paradise. The treasury, already thin from wars and mismanagement, could not sustain the flood of indulgence. Yet no minister dared speak the truth. Those who did were never seen again. The most infamous of his creations was the Hall of Gold. Once a reception chamber for visiting dignitaries, it became Ibrahim's private sanctuary. He commanded that its floor be covered in a layer of gold coins, deep enough to sink one's feet. Into this hall, he invited his concubines to dance, their bodies glistening with perfumed oil as they laughed nervously under his watchful gaze. To the Sultan, it was not mere pleasure. It was ritual, a performance meant to cleanse him of fear through abundance. Witnesses claimed he would sit silently on a raised dais, tossing handfuls of coins into the air, watching them scatter across the floor like rain. "This," he once said, "is the sound of loyalty." But even among his harem, loyalty had become a matter of survival. The women smiled, sang, and obeyed, though behind jeweled veils they trembled. Outside, the empire starved. Peasants sold their last possessions to pay taxes inflated by the Sultan's demands. Soldiers went unpaid. Merchants were robbed by desperate guards. Yet inside the palace, the candles burned all night. The contrast between glittering excess and spreading ruin became the empire's quiet disease. Cakesum Sultan watched the decay with a heart heavy from years of endurance. She had seen cruelty before, her late husband's executions, her other son's brutality, but never this kind of slow collapse. She pleaded with Ibrahim to curb his madness, to think of the empire's stability. "You were born a prisoner," she reminded him, "but do not make your people share your cell." He laughed, a sound sharp enough to cut through her composure. "They are already prisoners, mother," he said. "They just do not know who holds the key." Soon after, she withdrew from daily affairs, her influence nearly gone. The viziers and generals whispered rebellion, but their courage faltered beneath the Sultan's unpredictable wrath. One night, Ibrahim filled his bath not with water, but with amber oil and petals of crushed rose. He lay beneath the shimmering surface, his skin shining as if gilded. "I am the empire," he murmured. "So long as I shine, it cannot die." Outside, thunder rolled over Constantinople. The rain struck the golden roofs, washing nothing clean. One evening, Sultan Ibrahim lingered alone in his private chamber, the golden glow of candles reflecting off the polished walls and gilded furniture. The mirrors he had installed, dozens of them, were meant to amplify his majesty, to show the empire's reflection in his image. Yet as he gazed into one, he saw not a sultan, but a boy trembling in a cage. His own eyes betrayed the terror he had carried for decades. The mirror revealed a truth he could neither deny nor endure. The vision unnerved him profoundly. In that flickering reflection, he perceived conspiracies where there were none. He imagined ministers whispering treason behind their hands, concubines plotting seduction as a prelude to betrayal, eunuchs plotting to steal the throne for themselves. Every polished surface became a witness to treachery, and every shadow a silent enemy. That night, the Sultan's paranoia erupted into fury. By dawn, loyal ministers found themselves summoned one by one. Those accused of treason were dragged to the dungeons beneath Topkapı, their pleas echoing faintly through stone corridors. Torture became both interrogation and punishment, and some never emerged. Even men who had served Ibrahim faithfully for decades vanished, leaving nothing but the chill of absence in the palace halls. The Sultan's rage was methodical. It was a storm directed by years of fear and confinement, now untethered by any sense of mercy. Concubines fared no better. Ibrahim accused several of plotting to undermine him through enchantments or seduction. They were stripped of their ornaments and confined to isolated chambers, guarded day and night. Some were forced to kneel on cold marble floors for hours, trembling under the weight of imagined guilt. Those who dared to protest were moved to the underground oubliettes, their fates whispered only among the eunuchs. Silence had become the currency of survival, and obedience the only path to life. Even Kaksim Sultan could not fully protect the women or the minister she had once guided. She attempted to calm her son, to remind him that mirrors reflect only what one brings into them, but Ibrahim heard only malice in her voice. "You serve no one but shadows," he told her, his eyes wide, his hands trembling. "Do you not see? They speak in every surface, whisper in every corner. Even you are no longer safe." The palace grew oppressive. Windows were sealed to prevent spies, mirrors replaced with polished bronze plates, their dark reflections offering only distorted shapes. Candles burned day and night to illuminate every chamber, yet even light failed to ward off the imagined enemies. The halls echoed with whispered accusations, footsteps that might not exist, and the quiet terror of those too frightened to speak. In private, Ibrahim would pace before the mirrors, muttering fragments of threats and pleas. He accused himself as much as he accused others, his voice a mixture of rage and despair. How can one rule when the reflection of fear is everywhere? He asked no one. Sometimes he would collapse in exhaustion, staring at the bronze plates, trying to will them into silence. The empire outside the palace continued its slow decay. Wars went unattended, taxes went uncollected, and the people starved while the Sultan waged battles with shadows. Constantinople remained a glittering cage for a ruler imprisoned by his own mind. By the time night fell again, Ibrahim had made a decree. All mirrors not sanctioned by him were to be removed. Only those he personally inspected could remain. The palace, once a reflection of imperial power, had become a labyrinth of paranoia, a testament to the Sultan's inability to distinguish friend from foe, truth from illusion. The boy who had once trembled behind golden latticework now trembled before his own reflection, haunted by every face, every shadow, and every gleaming surface. In the quietest corner of Topkapı Palace, hidden beneath the labyrinth of chambers and hallways, lay a cell few dared to enter. Here, Sultan Ibrahim's own son, Mehmed, was kept under Köksem Sultan's secret protection. The infant's life had been spared from the same fate that had claimed so many royal heirs, yet his presence in the palace was a tinderbox. One spark from the Sultan could ignite tragedy. Ibrahim had long believed that every child born to him carried the potential to end his reign. Each cry in the harem was not a promise of life, but a reminder of mortality. The Sultan's obsession with succession and blood purity had grown obsessive, bordering on mania. He would wander the harem at night, listening to whispers and muffled cries, imagining treachery in every sigh. His paranoia had blurred the line between reality and hallucination. When Köksem Sultan's attempt to shield Mehmed from harm was discovered, the consequences were immediate and terrifying. Guards informed the Sultan that a hidden infant was being harbored within the palace walls. Rage, centuries in the making, erupted in him like a volcanic tide. Ibrahim descended into the dungeons that evening, his bare feet slapping against the cold stone floors, the torches casting long shadows along the walls. The air was thick with fear and the scent of oil, damp from the centuries-old walls that held generations of secrets. He reached the cell where Mehmed lay, swaddled and crying softly, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. The Sultan knelt beside the crib, his expression torn between fatherly curiosity and the specter of terror. "Do you know what they do to sons like you?" he whispered, his voice shaking. The infant's wails seemed to answer with uncomprehending innocence. For the first time, Ibrahim spoke as a man who had been both prisoner and king, acknowledging the horror of a life dictated by confinement and fear. He studied the child's tiny hands, clenched as if holding on to life itself, and felt the weight of the generations that had come before, brothers who had been strangled, cousins erased, heirs vanished. Each step of the dynasty was marked by violence, and now, he alone held the balance between history repeating and mercy prevailing. Yet mercy was a fragile concept, easily shattered by decades of fear and obsession. Ibrahim lifted the infant and held him close to his chest, murmuring words he could barely understand himself. "I have known nothing but cages," he said, "and still I survive. Will you survive?" The baby's eyes met his, wide and uncomprehending, yet filled with the raw instinct of life. The paradox tore at Ibrahim's mind, the desire to protect and the impulse to destroy warring within him. By dawn, the infant was returned to Köksem's care, yet the encounter had left the Sultan restless. He began issuing decrees to control every aspect of his children's lives, ordering that none leave their rooms without supervision, that eunuchs and concubines report any sign of rebellion, and that every sound in the harem be accounted for. The walls of the palace seemed to close tighter around all who lived within them. That night, as Ibrahim sat alone in his chamber, he gazed at the shadows of the empty hallways. His son's cries still echoed in his ears, and he realized that confinement had not ended with the cage. It had followed him into the throne, into every corner of his reign, and now into the lives of those he loved most. The boy Mehmed slept unaware, yet his presence was a reminder. The cage was no longer just a place. It was a legacy, a disease passed from father to son, and there was no escape. By 1647, Constantinople was a city trembling on the edge of chaos. Famine gnawed at the populace, trade slowed to a trickle, and the Janissaries, the Sultan's once loyal elite troops, whispered of rebellion in taverns and hidden courtyards. Rumors of Ibrahim's madness had spread beyond the palace walls, reaching every district, every mosque, and every marketplace. The empire's heartbeat was uneven, its lifeblood drying in pockets where once loyalty had flowed. Inside Topkapı, the palace mirrored the turmoil outside. Ibrahim's paranoia had reached its zenith. Ministers and eunuchs spoke only when commanded, their lips trembling, their eyes darting to the walls as though each shadow might conceal a hidden enemy. Servants disappeared nightly. Their fates were never recorded. Those who survived told whispers of corpses displayed near the caves, a silent warning to any who might doubt the Sultan's vigilance. The same prison that had shaped Ibrahim now imprisoned all who lived under his rule. Kaksem Sultan, ever the strategist, began plotting quietly with the viziers. She understood that the empire could not survive her son's unbridled fury. She held counsel in whispered tones, mapping alliances with generals and bureaucrats who still remembered their loyalty to the state rather than the sultan. Every move was cautious, measured, because one misstep could send Ibrahim into a rage that would consume the entire palace. Yet she knew rebellion would come, whether orchestrated by her hand or forced by circumstance. Meanwhile, Ibrahim's perception of reality eroded further. He began to suspect his own concubines of colluding with the janissaries. Every sound in the corridors, a falling plate, a faint laugh, a footstep out of rhythm, was interpreted as betrayal. Orders were given to execute without trial. Guards were sent to arrest anyone whose gaze seemed too inquisitive. Each act of punishment deepened the fear within the walls, ensuring obedience through terror rather than loyalty. The palace eunuchs whispered that Ibrahim would sometimes spend hours staring at empty chambers, muttering, "They are all plotting. Every face hides a dagger. Even my mother will betray me." Those who spoke against him vanished, leaving only silence behind. The Sultan's paranoia was contagious, infecting even the closest attendants with dread, creating a palace where trust had become impossible. Outside, the janissaries' whispers grew louder. They discussed the Sultan's excesses, the starvation of the provinces, the executions that left the court hollow. Their loyalty wavered, and small skirmishes in the suburbs hinted at the power of organized discontent. The empire's foundation, obedience born of fear, was cracking. Ibrahim's fury reached its apex during one night of ceremonial inspection. He ordered that 3 servants be executed in the palace courtyard, their bodies left hanging as grotesque reminders of consequence. Guards were forced to witness the spectacle, and eunuchs trembled as they carried messages to the Sultan's mother. For the first time, Kaksem realized that her son's madness was no longer tolerable. It was fatal. The palace, once a symbol of imperial grandeur, had transformed into a chamber of terror. The gilded halls echoed with cries of the innocent, the smell of oil and incense mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Ibrahim's reign was no longer one of leadership. It was a relentless living nightmare for all who dwelled within. As dawn broke over Constantinople, the whispers of rebellion began to stir into action. The janissaries would soon move, but the cage had already extended beyond its gilded walls. Every soul in the palace, from the Sultan to the servants, was now bound by fear, waiting for the storm that would determine whether the empire survived, or whether the madness within Topkapı would consume all. By the summer of 1648, the whispers that had haunted Constantinople erupted into a roar. The janissaries, long restrained by loyalty and fear, marched toward the palace with drums that echoed the unrest of the empire. The streets swarmed with the poor, the desperate, and the military, their combined murmurs forming a chorus of impending reckoning. Inside Topkapı, Sultan Ibrahim remained oblivious to the magnitude of the storm outside, absorbed entirely by the shadows of his own creation. The palace had become a labyrinth of terror. Ministers huddled in chambers, eunuchs whispered warnings into the walls, and the concubines of the harem held their breath, praying the Sultan's attention would remain elsewhere. Ibrahim patrolled the halls, muttering to himself, convinced that spies had infiltrated the very walls. He suspected even his mother of treachery, though Keksum Sultan had spent decades maintaining her careful influence over him. Now, even her authority could not temper his fear. The Janissaries breached the outer gates, their banners waving like dark omens. Word reached Ibrahim as he sat alone in his private chamber, staring at polished bronze that had once reflected mirrors. The realization hit him slowly, like a tide washing over stone. The rebellion was no rumor. The empire had moved against him. Panic overtook reason. He ordered the doors of the harem locked, yet he knew it was futile. The same golden cages that had once confined him as a boy now loomed over his entire life. Guards loyal only to survival hesitated at orders, unsure whether to defend their master or flee. Ibrahim's voice trembled as he called for ministers who no longer dared appear. Every corner of the palace felt like a trap, every face a potential assassin. Keksum Sultan attempted a final intervention, pleading with him to flee, to surrender, and perhaps spare his life. But Ibrahim, who had lived decades in the shadow of fear, could not accept mercy without suspicion. His terror was raw, unfiltered, consuming the last remnants of his rationality. He screamed for the gates to be barred, for the walls to rise, for the cage to be reforged. Yet the empire outside had already moved beyond control. When the Janissaries stormed the harem, there was no resistance. The Sultan's attendants fled or surrendered quietly, knowing that survival depended upon compliance. Ibrahim was dragged from his chamber, his silk robes torn, his golden slippers scuffed. As he was pulled toward the familiar confines of the caves, the weight of history pressed upon him. He had escaped its walls once, only to be brought back by the very forces he had feared all his life. His final words, raw and unguarded, shattered the air. "Do not lock me there again," he screamed, not in rage but in absolute terror. The echo of the gilded cage, the echo of every whispered execution, every vanished servant and concubine, pressed against his mind. Time seemed to stretch as the door approached, a portal that had defined his entire existence. The cage closed. The lock clicked. Silence descended. Outside, the empire exhaled, a collective sigh that mingled relief with horror, for they had witnessed a reign dictated by madness, fear, and obsession. For Ibrahim, history had come full circle. The child who had trembled behind latticework, the man who had bathed in gold and hunted shadows in mirrors, was now once again a prisoner. The throne had abandoned him. The palace had abandoned him. Even his own mother had watched helplessly as the cage reclaimed its eternal hold. In the quiet of the gilded cell, the Sultan realized with the clarity that comes only to those trapped by fate, that confinement had been the only constant in his life. And now as then, it would not let him go. Sultan Ibrahim, once the ruler of a vast empire, now sat alone in the caves, the gilded cage that had shaped the terror and obsession of his life. The walls glimmered with the reflection of candlelight, yet no warmth reached him. The boy who had trembled behind latticework, the man who had bathed in gold, the ruler who had executed without mercy, all were reduced to silence. The empire's laughter, its cries, its battles and festivals were gone. Only the cold, unyielding presence of the cage remained. Days passed in oppressive quiet. The servants had vanished, the concubines removed, and even Keksum Sultan's influence could not penetrate the small cell. Ibrahim's mind, long nourished by paranoia, fear, and obsession, now had only itself for company. He traced the contours of the gilded bars with trembling fingers, recalling every sound, every shadow, every betrayal that had marked his life. He realized with bitter clarity that confinement had been the thread that tied every horror together, from the death of his brothers to the vanished infants of his own harem. The empire outside continued, indifferent to his suffering. Constantinople's markets reopened, the Janissaries enforced order, and the treasury began to recover from the excesses of his reign. But within the walls of the palace, time seemed suspended. Each hour was marked only by the whisper of wind through the lattice and the soft, metallic echo of the bars when he shifted in his sleep. Even dreams brought no relief. They were haunted by visions of the children he had condemned, the ministers he had tortured, and the concubines who had smiled with fear in their eyes. Then, one morning, silent eunuchs entered the chamber. They carried with them a bowstring of silk, the tool of Ottoman royal execution. Ibrahim recognized it instantly. There was no struggle, no argument, no final plea. His reign, built upon fear and confinement, was ending in silence. The empire had neither vengeance nor mercy in this act, only the calculated closure of a cycle that had begun the day he first entered the gilded cage. He knelt, hands bound, the silk bowstring looped around his neck. For a brief moment, the Sultan was a man again, stripped of titles and illusions. He thought of his mother, of Mehmed, of the empire he had ruled through terror and obsession. He realized that power built on fear was ephemeral. It could dominate walls, hearts, and minds, but it could not survive the judgment of those it oppressed. As the silk tightened, his last thoughts were not of rage, nor of pleading. They were of confinement, the caves, the shadows, the invisible bars that had defined his entire existence. He saw, in one final reflection of memory, the faces of those he had loved and destroyed, the echoes of laughter, cries, and whispers that had haunted the palace halls. The bowstring drew taut. The Sultan's body slumped, but his mind lingered for a fleeting instant between terror and clarity. The reign of Ibrahim, marked by madness, cruelty, and obsession, ended not with the roar of armies or the clamor of the people, but with the quiet inevitability of a life constrained by its own fears. Outside, the empire breathed again. Within, the cave stood silent, a testament to the cycles of power, confinement, and cruelty that had shaped generations. Ibrahim's death was not justice, not revenge, not even relief. It was the final echo of a life consumed by terror, a reminder that history often repeats itself in the most haunting ways, and that the cages we build, gilded or otherwise, define not only our bodies, but our souls. And thus ended the reign of the Sultan who had ruled through fear, whose life was forever bound to the shadows of his gilded prison, leaving behind a legacy of caution, horror, and tragic inevitability.